The sudden disappearance. It was a warm Friday evening in mid-July 2015 when the cozy little town of Riverdale started to settle down for the night. Located in the heart of the Midwest, Riverdale was the kind of tight-knit, everyone-knows-your-name place where the loudest sound after sunset would likely be crickets chirping from neighboring fields or the occasional rumble of a passing freight train. It wasn't the kind of town where people disappeared, until that night. Carter Blake, a 27-year-old ER doctor with a reputation for a steady hand in the operating room, and an even steadier demeanor, had just wrapped up a 10-hour shift at County General Hospital. Known for his work ethic and friendly smile, Carter was something of a hometown hero. Born and raised in Riverdale, he had gone off to medical school with dreams of making it big, but eventually returned home to serve the very community that had raised him. That night, like many others, Carter drove his dusty blue pickup into his parents' driveway where he still lived to save money while paying off student loans. His mom, Linda, was as warm as the aroma of her signature apple pie cooling on the counter that evening. His dad, Tom, a retired hardware store owner, was unwinding in front of the television, catching the final innings of a baseball game. "Hey Mom, smells great in here. Is that for me?" Carter teased as he walked into the kitchen, tired but cheerful. "Always for you, my favorite son," Linda replied with a grin, handing him a plate before he could protest that he was her only child. Carter sat down, savoring the slice of pie as the family chatted about plans for the upcoming weekend. It was all so ordinary, comfortable even sure. Here's an extended version of One Sudden Disappearance, written in an engaging narrative style with a distinctly American tone. Sudden disappearance. The summer of 2015 was a sleepy one in Riverdale, a quiet little town nestled in the rolling hills of the American Midwest. It was the kind of place where everybody knew your name, where porch swings creaked in the evening breeze, and where any excitement beyond a 4th of July parade felt worlds away. That's why the entire town was shaken to its core when Carter Blake, a 27-year-old rising star in the medical field, simply vanished without a trace. For most of his life, Carter was the kind of guy everyone admired. Handsome, with sharp features and a warm smile that lit up a room, he had the uncanny ability to make anyone feel at ease. He was known for his unshakable work ethic and a heart of gold. Graduating at the top of his med school class, Carter had returned to his hometown to work at Riverdale Regional, the same hospital where his mother had given birth to him. People liked to joke that Carter was destined to heal Riverdale, just as his small-town roots had healed him. It was a warm Friday evening, like any other, when Carter stepped out of his family's modest white farmhouse. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and fireflies danced among the cornfields. His mom, Linda, was in the kitchen making her famous rhubarb pie, while his dad, Earl, sipped an iced tea on the porch. "Need anything from the store?" Carter asked casually, slipping his car keys into the pocket of his well-worn jeans. "Milk!" Linda called from the sink, her hands busy washing produce. "And eggs if they've got 'em on sale." "You sure you don't need me to pick up anything special for Sunday's cookout?" Carter grinned, knowing his mom always liked an excuse to bake for the neighbors. Linda smiled back, shaking her head. "Just don't be late, honey. The Smiths are stopping by tonight." "Got it, Mom," Carter replied, flashing that million-dollar grin as he walked out the door. There was no warning, no hesitation in his step, nothing to indicate that this would be the last time the Blakes would ever see their son walk out of that house. By 11 p.m. that night, Linda started pacing in the living room. Earl tried to play it cool, watching some late-night talk show on TV, but the volume on the screen couldn't drown out Linda's growing concern. "He said he wasn't going far, Earl. It doesn't take 4 hours to buy milk. Did he say where he was headed?" Linda nearly scolded, wringing her hands nervously. "You know how Carter is," Earl replied. "Maybe he ran into someone at the corner store. Half the town's there on a Friday night, it's probably gossip hour." But deep down, Earl felt that itch of unease too. Carter wasn't just punctual, he was dependable. The kind of guy who never failed to call if he was running late. Something just didn't feel right. When midnight rolled around and there was still no sign of Carter, Linda's fear reached a boiling point. "I'm calling him," she declared, grabbing the cordless phone. The first 3 calls went straight to voicemail. "Hi, this is Carter. I can't pick up the phone right now. Leave a message and I'll get back to you if it's important." Linda's voice quivered as she left her 3rd message, urging her son to call her back. "Maybe his phone's dead," Earl offered weakly, although he didn't entirely believe it himself. But when Carter still hadn't walked through the door by 1 a.m., Linda couldn't sit still any longer. "Earl, something's wrong," she said firmly. "I know my son. He wouldn't just disappear like this. Go drive into town and look for his car. Earl sighed but grabbed his jacket and keys. You're probably overthinking it, Linda, but okay. I'll take a look, just try to relax. He kissed her forehead before heading out the door, but beneath his calm exterior, worry was brewing. As Earl drove slowly through the dark streets of Riverdale, scanning for any sign of Carter's car, Linda was back at home dialing their son's number again and again. Each unanswered ring brought more dread. By 2 a.m. her hands were trembling and her stomach was in knots. When Earl returned an hour later empty-handed, Linda left no room for optimism. We're reporting him missing in the morning, she said resolutely. Something's happened to him, Earl. I can feel it. Riverdale had its fair share of odd stories, a lost dog here, a runaway teenager there. But the case of Carter Blake's disappearance was unlike anything the town had ever seen. By dawn, the Blakes had notified the local police. Within hours, word spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. Flyers were plastered on utility poles, and Carter's face became the symbol of an overwhelming question that no one could answer. What happened to Dr. Carter Blake? Everyone in town pitched in, from high schoolers ditching summer jobs to elderly neighbors handing out coffee to the search teams. But as the hours turned into days, the air grew heavy with unease. Theories began to swirl. Some whispered of foul play, while others clung to the hope that perhaps Carter had simply needed to clear his head. However, everything changed when Linda received a chilling text from an unknown number that afternoon. "Mom, I just need some time away. Please stop looking for me. I'll be back when I'm ready." The message was brief, almost robotic, alien to the Carter she knew. It wasn't his voice, not the warmth or humor he usually carried in his words. Linda reread the text until her heart squeezed with dread. "This isn't Carter," she whispered. "I know my son. Something terrible has happened to him." The family's desperate search. Saturday morning in Riverdale dawned hot and sticky, an unrelenting summer sun spreading its rays over the quiet suburban streets. But inside the Blake household the atmosphere was anything but calm. Linda Blake had barely slept a wink all night, her heart heavy with worry that refused to subside. She'd spent most of the early morning pacing the living room, staring helplessly at the blank screen of her phone, and willing it to illuminate with a call or text from Carter. By the time the clock struck 7, Linda couldn't bear the silence anymore. She walked briskly into the kitchen, where Earl was pouring himself a cup of black coffee, his usual comforting morning ritual. His hand trembled slightly as he brought the mug to his lips. "Earl," Linda said, her voice tight with tension, "he didn't come home. You were out all night looking. Are you sure you checked everywhere?" Earl set his coffee down and sighed deeply, his eyes bloodshot. "I drove every road in this damn town, Linda. Checked the parking lot at the corner store, the diner, the park. I didn't see his truck anywhere." Linda stared at him, her frustration bubbling over. "How can he just vanish, Earl? He's a grown man, not some irresponsible teenager. This isn't like Carter. Something's not right. I can feel it in my bones." Earl looked down at the table, avoiding her gaze. He'd been trying to push down the dark possibilities swirling in his own mind all night, but he knew Linda was right. "I don't know, Linda, I just don't know. Maybe he's over at a friend's house and forgot to call, you know. Maybe he needed to clear his head." Linda shook her head sharply. "Clear his head? Earl, when has Carter ever just gone off without telling us? And what kind of a clearing his head means ignoring his mother's calls all night?" Her voice cracked with emotion. Earl reached out to place a hand on hers, but she pulled away, heading toward the landline phone sitting on the counter. "I'm calling Sheriff Daniels right now. We're filing a missing persons report." "Linda," Earl said hesitating, "you know the sheriff's just gonna tell us it's too soon. They're gonna say we need to wait 48 hours for an adult to be considered officially missing." "I don't care," Linda shot back, gripping the phone like it was her lifeline. "If the sheriff won't help us, I'll drag every single person in this town out of their homes to look for him myself." Before Earl could respond, Linda punched in the sheriff's office number. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Riverdale Sheriff's Department. This is Deputy Rhodes." "Rhodes, it's Linda Blake," Linda said quickly. "My son Carter hasn't come home. He's been missing since last night and I need the sheriff here now." "Morning, ma'am," Rhodes replied, sounding a bit surprised. It was still early for weekend calls. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions yet. How long has he actually been gone?" "He left the house around 9 o'clock last night, said he'd grab something from the store. He hasn't come home. He's not answering his phone, and Earl couldn't find his truck anywhere in town," Linda said, her words tumbling out fast. Rhodes hummed thoughtfully on the other end of the line. "Did Carter mention planning to meet anyone? Maybe one of his friends?" "No," Linda snapped. "He didn't say anything about meeting anyone. "You know my son, Deputy. He's a responsible young man. He wouldn't just take off like this. Something's happened to him." "All right, Mrs. Blake," Rhodes said, his tone softening. "I'll pass this along to the sheriff, but you know the protocol. Adults are allowed to go missing if they want, or, take some time away. It might not be anything sinister. That said, we'll open a case if he's still unaccounted for in 48 hours. Linda's face flushed with frustration as she slammed the receiver back down. 48 hours, she muttered angrily. That's 2 whole days. Anything could happen in 2 days. Earl, who had been observing from the kitchen table, stood up and approached her cautiously. "Linda, let's not wait. Let's take matters into our own hands." "What do you mean?" Linda asked, crossing her arms. "I mean, we search," Earl said firmly. "We pull in the neighbors, call his friends, anyone who might have talked to him yesterday. Hell, I'll even print out his photo and put up flyers around town if I have to. We're not just gonna sit around and wait for the bureaucracy to catch up. This is our son." Linda swallowed hard, her husband's determination igniting a tiny flicker of hope in her chest. "All right," she agreed quietly. "All right, let's do it." By mid-morning, Earl had called half of the Blake family and a few of Carter's childhood friends. A group of 8 people, armed with Carter's recent photograph and a desperate determination, spread out across Riverdale. They knocked on doors, checked local parks, gas stations, and diners. Some folks at the grocery store vaguely remembered seeing Carter's truck in the parking lot late the previous evening, but nobody could confirm exactly when or where he'd gone after that. Meanwhile, Linda stayed glued to the home phone, dialing Carter's number over and over again. Each voicemail greeting left her more heartsick than the last. Twice, she broke down into sobs, Earl finding her clutching the receiver like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. By nightfall on Saturday, the town had begun to catch wind of the situation. News of Carter's disappearance spread quickly in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Riverdale hadn't seen a case like this in years. Most folks were content to assume this kind of thing only happened in big cities or on TV dramas. Linda paced the living room, her face tight with exhaustion. Earl returned home from hours of searching and slumped into his old lazy-boy chair. "Not a damn thing, Linda. It's like he just disappeared." She stared at him, her voice trembling as she whispered, "What if he's hurt, Earl? What if something awful has happened and he's out there, somewhere, needing our help?" Earl didn't have an answer for her. All he could do was sit in silence, staring at the family photo on the wall, the one where Carter looked so full of life, standing proudly between his parents during his medical school graduation. At that very moment, their house phone rang, slicing through the tense silence like a dagger. Linda lunged for it, her shaking hands fumbling to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" she said breathlessly. For a brief second there was nothing but static on the other end of the line, then the monotone voice of an operator. "Message received. No further inquiries, please." "Who is this?" Linda screamed into the phone. "Where is my son?" But the line clicked dead. Earl jumped out of his chair. "What the hell was that?" Linda grabbed at her throat, her face pale. "Earl! It was like someone was telling us to stop looking." The mysterious message. It was early Sunday afternoon when the Blake household was hit with another wave of dread. Linda Blake, still holding on to a shred of hope, had been poring over Carter's childhood album in the living room, trying to calm her nerves. Earl sat silently at the dining table, his eyes fixed on the Facebook post a family friend had put up about Carter's disappearance. Both of them were emotionally drained after spending the last 24 hours searching every corner of Riverdale without success. Suddenly Linda's phone buzzed, vibrating briefly on the coffee table. She reached for it instinctively, her heart racing as she saw the notification flash. "It's a text," Linda whispered, clicking on it with trembling hands. "Earl, it's from Carter." Earl shot up from his seat so fast he nearly knocked the chair into the floor. He rushed over to Linda's side. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice sharp with both hope and fear. Linda read aloud, her voice shaking. "Mom, I just need some time away. Please stop looking for me. I'll be back when I'm ready." The words hung heavy in the air, and Earl furrowed his brows in confusion. "That doesn't sound like Carter. Let me see that." Linda handed him the phone, her breath catching as tears welled up in her eyes. "Earl, Carter never talks to me like that. I just need some time away. He always calls me Mom. Not like this. Not so formal." Earl glanced at the phone, reading the message repeatedly as if the meaning might change. It's odd, for sure. But honey, maybe he really does need a break. You know, the hospital's been pushing him hard. ER shifts take a toll on a person." "No, Earl," Linda said sharply, standing up and pacing across the living room. "I know my son. When Carter's upset, he doesn't run away, and he certainly doesn't send vague, cold messages like this. There's something off about it, even the wording, "Please stop looking for me." Carter would never say something like that. He'd tell me directly what's wrong. He'd call, not text. "You think somebody else wrote this?" Earl asked cautiously, looking up from the phone. Linda stopped pacing and stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. "What if someone's holding him hostage? What if they're trying to throw us off?" Her voice cracked and her hand shook as she clutched her chest. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Linda," Earl said, attempting to keep a calm tone. "It could still be Carter. Maybe he's feeling overwhelmed and just doesn't want to talk right now." "Overwhelmed?" Linda snapped, her voice rising in frustration. "So overwhelmed that he disappears for 2 nights in a row, ignores all my calls, and then sends a vague, robotic text message? Does that sound like my son to you, Earl?" Earl rubbed his temple, exhaling a deep sigh. "I don't know, Linda. I don't know what to think. I just know Carter isn't the type of person to leave us hanging like this unless there's a damn good reason." He paused for a moment before glancing at her again. What if it's not him at all? The question left them both frozen. It wasn't until Linda sank slowly onto the couch that she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. "If someone else has his phone, it means he's in real danger, doesn't it? Oh God, Earl, what are we going to do?" Earl sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her knee, though his face betrayed his growing concern. "We'll call the sheriff again, give them the text. Maybe they can trace it, see where it was sent from." Linda shook her head. "But what if that's what they want us to do? What if whoever has him realizes we're onto them and they—" Her voice broke off as she couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. "Linda," Earl said firmly, pulling her gaze to his, "we don't have another choice. If something did happen to Carter, the sheriff needs to know about this. If it is him, then at least we can start piecing together why he might have sent it. Either way, we have to do something." Linda nodded reluctantly, wiping her eyes as she reached for the landline phone. As she dialed the sheriff's number, her hands trembled so badly that she misdialed twice before finally getting through. "Sheriff Daniels' office, Deputy Rhodes speaking." "Deputy, this is Linda Blake again," she said, her voice trembling. "We just got a text message. It's from Carter's phone, but something about it doesn't feel right." On the other end of the line, Rhodes paused briefly before responding. "All right, Mrs. Blake, can you read me the exact message?" Linda read out the text slowly, and there was silence for a moment before Rhodes responded. That is unusual. You're sure this doesn't sound like something Carter would say?" "I'm sure, Deputy," Linda said, her voice rising. "Carter wouldn't just text us when he knows we're worried sick. He would call, and the way it's worded, it feels wrong." "I hear you, ma'am," Rhodes said, his voice trying to sound reassuring. "This could be something we can work with, though. If the text came from his phone, we might be able to ping his last location again. We'll need to escalate this to Sheriff Daniels so he can authorize it. Sit tight, and I'll let you know as soon as we have something." "Deputy," Linda interjected, her voice sharp with urgency. "What if this isn't Carter at all? What if someone has his phone, and they're trying to make us back off?" Rhodes hesitated before replying. "We'll consider all possibilities, Mrs. Blake. For now, let us handle the technical side of things. Try to stay calm and we'll get back to you shortly." As she hung up the phone, Linda turned to Earl, her face pale and hollow. "If the police can't find him soon, Earl, I don't know what I'll do. That message, it isn't him. I just know it." Earl wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We'll find him," he murmured, "no matter what it takes." But deep down, Earl wasn't so sure. The words in that text kept gnawing at him, cold and distant in a way Carter had never been. "Please stop looking for me." The police step. By late Sunday afternoon, the weight of Carter Blake's disappearance had become unbearable. Linda and Earl Blake, still unable to shake the unnerving feeling left by the mysterious text, stood on the front porch of their modest white-clapboard home as Sheriff Daniels arrived with Deputy Rhodes. The police cruiser rumbled slightly as it pulled to a stop in their driveway. Sheriff Frank Daniels, nearing his late 50s, was a burly man with a slow drawl that could either calm nerves or drive people insane, depending on his tone. He adjusted his Stetson as he climbed out of the car, giving the Blakes a curt nod. Deputy Rhodes, younger and far less assured, followed closely behind, jotting something in a small notebook. "Afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Blake," Sheriff Daniels said as he climbed the porch steps. His towering presence seemed to dim the oppressive July heat just slightly. "Rhodes tells me you received a text from Carter's phone?" "Yes," Linda answered quickly, stepping forward, her phone clutched in both hands like it was a lifeline. "But it doesn't sound like him, Sheriff. It's short, cold. It's not my son, it's not his voice." Sheriff Daniels took a moment, brushing some dust off his shirt before responding. "Let's start with the text, ma'am. May I see it?" Linda handed him the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she did so. Daniels read the text silently, his brow furrowing as he took a step back, holding the phone closer to his chest. "Mom, I just need some time away. Please stop looking for me. I'll be back when I'm ready," Daniels repeated out loud, his tone measured. "And you're certain this doesn't sound like something Carter would say?" "Absolutely not," Linda said firmly. She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. "He's not the type to just leave us. Sheriff, something's wrong. I don't care what that text says. This isn't Carter." "She's right," Earl added, standing beside her. "Carter's not a runaway. He's dependable, responsible. Hell, we raised that boy not to leave people hanging, especially not his family. He wouldn't just text us and disappear." Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly and passed the phone back to Linda. "All right, let's assume for now this text isn't from him. We'll try to trace its origin. With any luck, whoever sent it wasn't smart enough to disable GPS tracking." Deputy Rhodes, still jotting furiously in his notepad, chimed in. "We'll contact the phone carrier. It might take a bit of time to get through the red tape, but if the text was sent from Carter's phone, we can ping it and see where it originated from." Linda looked at the deputy, her eyes wide with desperation. "Time? How much time, deputy? Carter's been gone more than 48 hours. I can feel it in my gut. Something's happened to him. We don't have time." Rhodes shifted uncomfortably under Linda's intense gaze, but Daniels interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Blake, we understand how difficult this is. Rest assured, we're treating this seriously, but tracking phones and gathering data doesn't happen in the blink of an eye. That said, we'll start immediately." "Tracking the phone is good, but we need more than that," Earl said, running a hand across his face. He pointed towards the neighborhood beyond the driveway. "He's not anywhere in town. We've already looked. Friends, parks, the grocery store, you name it, we've been there. You've got to get a search started beyond Riverdale." Daniels scratched his chin. "Mr. Blake, I can't send a search team beyond the town boundary without good reason. Missing adults, especially someone like Carter, a grown man with no known enemies, don't just vanish. There's a chance he's done exactly what the text says, taken time away." "That's bullsh!" Earl started, but Linda stopped him with a sharp look. "Sheriff, I know you have rules to follow," Linda said, her voice trembling but firm. "But this isn't just any adult. Carter's a doctor. He's always on call, always tethered to his phone. He's required to respond to emergencies at the hospital. He wouldn't just disconnect from everything." Daniels nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fair point. We'll speak with the hospital and see if anyone there noticed something unusual about his behavior or schedule before he disappeared." "You won't find anything," Linda said quietly. Her shoulders slumped, and she sank into the wooden porch swing. "Carter didn't plan this. He didn't leave on his own. I know it." The sheriff crouched slightly, leveling himself to Linda's eyeline. His southern drawl softened as he placed a hand on the backrest of the swing. "Mrs. Blake, I've been doing this job a long time. More often than not, there's an answer. It might not be the one we want, but there's one out there. And it's my job to find it, but I'm gonna need your help to do that." Linda sniffled, holding back tears. "I'll do whatever it takes, just find my son." Daniels stood upright, signaling for Rhodes to follow him as they stepped off the porch. "All right, first we'll get started on that phone trace. Rhodes, make sure to prioritize that with the carrier." "Yes, Sheriff. And we'll dig into his recent calls, see if he was in touch with anyone unusual before he disappeared," Daniels added, looking back at Linda. "Is there anything you can recall that seemed off about Carter in the weeks leading up to this? Did he mention feeling stressed or mention someone bothering him?" Linda hesitated for a moment, trying to search her memory. "He was just tired. The hospital's been busy, but that's normal for him. He kept saying he couldn't wait to save enough money to move out and get his own place, maybe take a vacation. But nothing. There wasn't anything strange." Earl crossed his arms, leaning against the porch railing. "What about his truck? You find anything on it?" "Not yet, but our officers have put out a bolo. Be on the lookout for his truck. If it turns up anywhere, we'll know," Daniels replied. "Sheriff," Linda said softly, standing up again, "if you think he's just out taking time away, let me ask you this. Why would he keep his phone off for 2 days? Why hasn't he been answering my calls if everything's fine?" Daniels took a deep breath. "Mrs. Blake, you're asking all the right questions, and trust me, we'll get answers. I promise we'll keep digging." As the sheriff and his deputy climbed into the cruiser, Linda felt a sinking pit in her stomach. The words, "we'll keep digging," felt hollow, like the start of a long, grueling path. Standing next to her, Earl tightened his jaw, his eyes staring out across the quiet street. "We're not waiting, Linda," he said firmly after a long silence. "I don't care what the sheriff says, we're starting our own damn search, tonight." The first lead. It was early Monday morning when the first glimmer of hope finally surfaced. Linda Blake sat in her living room, her shoulders hunched and her eyes glued to the phone, willing it to ring with new information. Earl, pacing across the creaky hardwood floor, was growing more agitated by the second. Neither of them had slept much since Carter's disappearance, and the weight of their uncertainty was beginning to crush them. Just as the silence became almost unbearable, the distinct buzz of Linda's phone cut through the air. "Answer it!" Earl nearly shouted, freezing mid-step. Linda didn't hesitate. Her shaking hands grabbed the phone, her voice trembling as she answered. "Hello, this is Linda Blake." "Mrs. Blake, this is Sheriff Daniels," came the gruff yet cautious voice on the other end. "We may have a lead on your son's whereabouts." Linda's breath quickened. "A lead? What do you mean? Did you find him? Is he okay?" "Not exactly," Daniels replied carefully. "One of my deputies has just gotten off the phone with the manager of a motel on the outskirts of Riverdale. Carter apparently checked into a room there late Friday night." A stunned silence hung in the room as Linda tried to process the words. Earl, who had leaned in to listen, let out a sharp exhale. "What?" Linda said softly, disbelief lacing her voice. "Checked into a motel?" "Carter wouldn't do that. He's not the kind of person to sneak off to some random motel. Why would he—" "We don't know the full story yet," Daniels interrupted, his voice steady. "But here's what we do know. According to the manager, your son paid for the room in cash. That alone makes the situation unusual. And—" He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "And what, Sheriff?" Linda urged, her fists clenching involuntarily. "And the manager mentioned that Carter wasn't alone," Daniels admitted. "He was seen arriving with a woman." The color drained from Linda's face. Earl's hand firmly gripped the back of the sofa for support as his expression turned grim. "A woman?" Linda sounded almost incredulous. "Who? What kind of woman? Did the manager know her?" Daniels continued. "The manager described her as a young woman, petite, blonde hair. Said she didn't seem familiar to him, definitely not a regular guest. Surveillance footage from the motel confirms that description. As far as we can tell, no one has seen either of them leave the room." "That doesn't make any sense." Linda's voice cracked slightly. "Carter doesn't know anyone like that, at least no one he's mentioned." "Are you sure it was him in the video?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniels replied definitively. "The footage clearly shows Carter entering the room with the woman Friday night, but there's no record of either of them checking out, and the housekeeping staff said the room's still locked from the inside." "Locked?" Earl interjected, his voice low and tense. "You mean no one's been in there since Friday?" The sheriff hesitated. "That's right, my deputies are on their way to the motel now to gain access to the room. The manager called us after seeing the missing person flyers with Carter's picture, so we need to handle this delicately." Linda's mind was racing. What if he's still there, Sheriff?" she stammered. "What if he's hurt? Or worse?" "I promise you, Mrs. Blake, we'll find out exactly what's going on," Daniels reassured her. "I'll call you again as soon as we know more." "What should we do?" Earl asked firmly, taking the phone from Linda's trembling hands. "You need us to come down there?" "I'd advise staying home for now," Daniels said. "If this lead pans out, you'll be the first to know, but the last thing we want is a crowd complicating the investigation." Earl clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "Fine, but you better let us know the second you figure anything out." "I will," Daniels assured him before hanging up. Linda collapsed back into her chair, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at Earl, searching his face for some semblance of comfort, but she found none. "A woman?" Linda said softly, almost to herself. "Who could it be, Earl? Carter's never even mentioned anyone like that. Why wouldn't he tell us if there was someone?" "I don't know," Earl muttered, shaking his head. "But none of this adds up. Paying cash for a motel room, showing up with someone he's never introduced to us, that's not our boy, Linda, it's just not." The air grew thick with tension as the two sat in silence. There was a faint hope in their minds that maybe Carter was safe, that this was all just some kind of misunderstanding, but deep down, a chilling fear was beginning to take hold. Not long after, Linda's phone buzzed again. It was Daniels. She answered so quickly that she almost dropped the phone. "Sheriff?" "Mrs. Blake, we've just gained access to the motel room." Daniel's voice was grim, and her heart sank before he even finished speaking. "Carter's not here. The room's empty. But there are signs of a struggle." Linda gasped audibly, and Earl leaned in closer, his face darkening. "What kind of signs?" "The bed's been stripped," Daniels explained. "There's broken glass near the nightstand and some Blood on the bathroom floor. It's not enough to suggest... His voice trailed off before he finished. Well, it's not enough to suggest anyone lost their life here, but it's definitely concerning. Linda's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. Blood! Oh God, Earl, what does this mean? We're treating this as a crime scene now, Daniels said firmly. My deputies are processing the room for evidence as we speak, and we're pulling more detailed surveillance footage from neighboring businesses to see if we can track Carter or the woman beyond the motel. And this woman, Earl growled, his voice filled with restrained anger. Whoever she is, she's the key to all this. We think so, Daniels agreed. We'll find out who she is. Meanwhile, I suggest you both stay close to the phone. Things might start moving quickly from here. As the call ended, Linda and Earl looked at each other, their expressions a mix of despair and determination. For the first time since Carter's disappearance, they had a lead, but it came with more questions than answers. Who was the woman? Why had Carter gone to that motel? And what had happened in that locked room over the course of 2 long, agonizing days? The mysterious woman's profile. By Monday evening, the investigation had taken a sharp and unsettling turn. Sheriff Daniels stood in his office poring over the surveillance footage from the motel. The grainy black and white video showed Carter Blake entering the room with a petite blonde woman late Friday night. Her face was partially obscured by the angle, but something about her demeanor, nervous glances, the way she clutched her purse, immediately struck Daniels as suspicious. Back at the Blake household, Linda and Earl were trying their best to remain calm, but the tension in the air made conversation nearly impossible. Then the phone rang. Linda scrambled to answer it, her hands shaking. "Hello? Sheriff Daniels?" she blurted anxiously. "Yes, Mrs. Blake," came the deep voice on the other end. "I'm calling with an update. We're starting to piece together information about the woman seen with Carter." Earl leaned forward in his chair, his jaw tight. "So who is she?" he demanded. Daniels took a breath before continuing. "We don't have a confirmed ID yet, but here's what we've got so far. The woman entered the motel with Carter around 9:45 p.m. Friday night, carrying what looks to be a small overnight bag. After that point, neither Carter nor the woman were seen leaving. However, earlier footage from a nearby gas station showed the two arriving in Carter's truck about 15 minutes before they checked in. The license plate matches." Linda's breath hitched. "She was in Carter's truck?" "That's correct," Daniels said. "The footage shows them getting out together. Carter didn't appear distressed, and he wasn't restrained in any way. They walked into the gas station together, bought some items, a bottle of water, some snacks, and then got back in the truck before heading to the motel." Earl frowned, his tone hard. "So you're telling me my son willingly drove this woman to a motel in the middle of the night? That doesn't sound like Carter. He doesn't do stuff like this. Are you sure he wasn't being coerced?" "It's hard to say," Daniels replied cautiously. "From the footage, Carter seems calm. He's talking to her, making gestures, almost like they're having a conversation. There's no indication at this point that he was forced into anything." Linda shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "Maybe she tricked him, or maybe he thought she needed help. That's who Carter is. He'd never ignore someone in trouble. Did you find anything on her yet? Does she have a name?" Daniels paused, his voice turning grimmer. "This is where things get murky. We ran her image through our database, and I just got confirmation from federal authorities. Based on her appearance and a match to a known alias, the woman seen with Carter is likely Emily Grayson." "Emily Grayson?" Linda repeated, her voice low and disbelieving. Daniels continued, "Emily Grayson has a record. She's been on law enforcement's radar for a while. Late 20s, transient. She's previously been convicted of petty fraud, credit card scams, forged checks, and has a documented history of manipulating people to get what she wants." Earl gritted his teeth. "So what the hell was she doing with my son? Why would someone like her be with Carter?" "That's what we need to find out," Daniel said. "We're pulling records on all known associates and her prior arrests. It's possible she managed to get close to Carter under false pretenses. Maybe she pretended to know someone he worked with, or she faked an emergency he felt obligated to help with. At this point, it's speculation." Linda's eyes were wide with shock, her mind racing. She must have lied to him. Carter is far too smart to get involved with someone like that. She must have tricked him, Sheriff." "It's possible," Daniels agreed. "But we can't rule anything out yet. This Emily Grayson is known for being resourceful, manipulative, and..." He hesitated slightly. "Dangerous." That last word hit Linda and Earl like a freight train. "Dangerous?" Earl's voice was sharp. "What does that mean? Has she hurt people before?" "There's no record of physical violence," Daniels clarified. "But there are unofficial accounts from one of her previous victims. A man claimed she drugged him after convincing him to let her into his home, stole his belongings, and disappeared. Unfortunately, the charges didn't stick because there wasn't enough evidence to convict her. Linda pressed her palm against her chest, feeling an overwhelming wave of fear. So she could have done something to Carter? Sheriff, do you think she's holding him somewhere? It's too early to say, Daniel said carefully. What we do know is that she's vanished without a trace before. If she's involved in Carter's disappearance, chances are she's already on the move. We've issued a bolo for her and Carter's truck. If she's still driving it, we'll find her. Earl's face reddened with anger. None of this is good enough, Sheriff. That's my son out there. And all you've got is some name and a bunch of guesses about some con artist? You need to be doing more than that. We understand how you feel, Mr. Blake, Daniel said evenly, but we're doing everything we can to track her down. Emily Grayson is now a person of interest, and we're treating this case as a potential criminal investigation. We'll keep you updated as soon as we have more to go on. As he hung up, Linda slumped into the couch, the overwhelming weight of the news sinking in. Emily Grayson, she said softly, her hands gripping the sides of her head. Why, Earl? Why would someone like her target Carter? He isn't rich, he doesn't live some flashy life. Why him? Earl didn't respond right away, instead pacing furiously around the room. Finally he stopped, his voice low and steady. Because Carter has the one thing con artists like that love the most. Trust. He's too good, Linda. Earl's voice cracked slightly. He always sees the best in people. And sometimes, he paused, his eyes distant, that's the kind of thing that gets good people hurt. Linda buried her face in her hands, trying to push away the looming fear that something irreversible had already happened. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Daniels leaned back in his chair, staring hard at the grainy photo of Emily Grayson on his desk. He had a deep, sinking feeling in his gut. If they didn't move fast, they were going to lose precious time, and possibly any chance to bring Carter Blake home alive. A troubled past. By Tuesday morning, the investigation into Emily Grayson was beginning to reveal unsettling new details. Sheriff Daniels sat in his office, poring over a growing pile of reports on Emily's past. Her name might have been new to the Blakes, but to law enforcement, Emily Grayson was a ghost, a drifter with a knack for leaving chaos and confusion in her wake. What was beginning to emerge wasn't just a petty con artist, but a deeply troubled woman with a pattern of manipulation and destruction. That same morning, Daniels decided it was time to break the news to Linda and Earl. He arrived at their home with Deputy Rhodes, carrying a document folder that already felt heavier than it should. On the porch, Linda opened the door with a look of anticipation and dread. "Sheriff, did you find anything? Is it about Carter?" Daniels removed his hat and nodded. "Not yet, Mrs. Blake, but we've started getting a clearer picture of who Emily Grayson is. I think it's important you both hear this." Linda glanced over her shoulder at Earl, who was sitting stiffly in the living room, staring at yet another cold cup of coffee in his hands. She ushered the sheriff and deputy inside. Earl stood as they entered. "If you aren't here to tell me you found Carter, I hope you've at least got something useful," he said, his frustration barely contained. Daniels held up the folder. "This might help us understand what your son was dealing with, Mr. Blake." He motioned for them to sit as he took a seat on the couch. Linda immediately settled beside Earl while Rhodes moved to a corner of the room, flipping through his notes. Daniels opened the folder, spreading out papers on the coffee table. The top document had a photo, a blurry mugshot of Emily Grayson from a years-old arrest. "This is her," Daniels began. "Emily Grayson, 29 years old, no permanent address, no stable work history. She spent the last decade moving between states, using a string of aliases. Her resume is nothing but trouble." Linda stared at the photo, her heart sinking. "She looks normal, just like anyone else." "That's part of her game," Daniels explained. "She doesn't just look normal, she knows how to act normal, at least until she doesn't have to anymore. She's conned people out of thousands of dollars by pretending to be someone she's not. A nursing student, a single mom, a woman in distress, whatever it takes to earn someone's trust." Earl leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. "And what about Carter? Why the hell would someone like this target him?" Daniel sighed. "The truth is, we don't know yet. But from what we've gathered, she doesn't just go after people for money. In some cases, she targets people who fix things." "Fix things?" Linda asked, her brow furrowed. "People with a savior complex," Daniels clarified. "Good-hearted folks who think they can help her. Doctors, teachers, community workers. She's drawn to people who are empathetic, who'll listen to her sob stories and offer a hand. And once she's got her hooks in," he trailed off, shaking his head. Earl slammed his fist on the arm of the couch. That's Carter to a goddamn T. Always trying to help people, even strangers. It's no wonder she latched onto him. But what did she want from him? Linda pressed. Did she need money? Was she taking advantage of him? Daniels hesitated but then leaned forward, clasping his hands together. This is where it gets complicated. We discovered through prior records that Emily doesn't always con people for financial gain. In fact, her past suggests something more troubling. She's been known to spiral into obsessive behavior. Obsessive! Linda's voice was trembling now. She doesn't just take from people, Rhodes interjected from the corner, surprising them. He held up one of the notes he had been reviewing. She takes over their lives. In one case, she moved in with a man she'd befriended, and slowly isolated him from his family. At first, she made him feel sorry for her, claimed she was running from an abusive ex, then she started controlling everything. His money, his schedule, even his social life. By the time he figured out what was happening, she was gone, and so was everything he owned. Linda brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. Oh my God, are you saying she was trying to do that to Carter? It's possible, Daniel said grimly. Carter's a young, accomplished guy, works long hours, probably doesn't spend much time outside of work and family. Maybe she saw an opening, a way to insert herself into his life under the guise of needing help. But that doesn't make sense, Earl said, shaking his head. If she wanted to manipulate him, why would there be blood in that motel room? Why would she leave without him? That's what we're trying to piece together, Daniels admitted. Because here's the other thing about Emily's history. It's not all about cons. There's another side to her. He pulled out a second paper from the folder. What do you mean? Linda whispered, dreading the answer. Daniels placed the paper on the table. 3 years ago, Emily was involved in a domestic dispute in St. Louis. Police were called to the apartment of a man she was dating at the time. Neighbors reported hearing screaming. When officers arrived, they found the man unconscious with a head injury. Emily claimed it was self-defense, told the cops he'd attacked her. Charges were dropped due to lack of evidence, but the medical report suggested something different. Based on his injuries, it looked less like a fight and more like an ambush. Linda gasped, and Earl's fists clenched. So you're saying she's violent? Earl growled, his voice low and angry. You think she hurt Carter? We're not ruling anything out, Daniels replied. But one thing we've learned about Emily is that when she feels like she's losing control, she lashes out. She doesn't just walk away quietly. She makes a mess before she disappears. Linda buried her face in her hands, her voice choked with emotion. This is all my fault. I should have noticed if something was wrong. If he seemed off— Linda, no, Earl said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder. This isn't on you. Carter wouldn't have said anything if he thought he was helping someone. That's just who he is. Daniel stood, his expression heavy. We're working on connecting the dots. Right now the priority is figuring out where Emily went next. I need you both to think. Did Carter ever mention meeting anyone new? A patient maybe? Someone he was spending time with outside of work? Linda blinked through her tears, searching her memory. No, wait, he did mention running into someone at the grocery store a few weeks ago. Said she seemed lost, asked him for directions. He joked about how eager some people around here are to talk to strangers. That could have been her, Daniel said, nodding. It fits the pattern. She likes to build trust in casual settings before escalating things. Earl's voice hardened again. Whatever her game is, Sheriff, it ends here. You find her, you hear me? You find her before she disappears again. Daniels tipped his hat. That's the plan, Mr. Blake, I promise you. We're not letting this one get away. As the sheriff and Rhodes left, Linda and Earl sat in stunned silence. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but every new piece only made the picture darker, more frightening. The gruesome scene. Tuesday afternoon brought a mix of frantic energy and deep unease to Sheriff Daniels' office. The phone call came while he was briefing a team of deputies on Emily Grayson's troubling backstory. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to one of the officers at the motel, his tone grim and urgent. We found something in room 108, the officer said flatly. You'll want to come see this. It's bad. Daniels immediately assembled his team, including Deputy Rhodes, and headed straight for the secluded motel on the outskirts of Riverdale. He had called ahead to inform Linda and Earl Blake, who insisted on driving to the scene despite Daniels' protests. When the Blakes arrived, the area around the room had already been cordoned off with bright yellow police tape. A few motel guests loitered in the parking lot, whispering among themselves, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. For a place that rarely saw anything more exciting than a water leak, the presence of police vehicles, crime scene investigators, and forensic vans was extraordinary. As Linda and Earl stepped out of their car, Sheriff Daniels met them halfway, holding his hands up to stop them. "Mr. and Mrs. Blake, you really shouldn't see what's inside," Daniel said in a low, serious voice. Linda immediately stiffened. "What did you find, Sheriff?" she demanded, her voice trembling but fierce. "Is it Carter?" Daniels exhaled slowly. "We don't know yet, but let's just say the state of the room raises serious concerns. Blood was found in the bathroom. Not a lot, but enough to indicate something violent happened here." Earl's face darkened, his hands forming fists at his sides. "Blood?" he growled. "Whose blood? Carter's?" "We're in the process of collecting and testing samples," Daniels explained, trying to remain calm. "It will take some time to confirm. Until then, I need you both to stay out here. Let us do our job." "No!" Linda snapped, her voice breaking. "That's my son's blood, I just know it. You have to let us see where he was. Please, Sheriff. I need to know." Daniel studied her face for a moment, the anguish, the determination. He finally relented, sighing heavily. "All right, but you don't go past the doorway, I mean it. Franklin will escort you." He waved over a deputy who nodded and motioned for the Blakes to follow. As they approached room 108, Linda felt her legs weaken, and Earl instinctively put an arm around her for support. The door to the room was wide open, the interior illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. A crime scene technician in white coveralls stepped to the side, giving the family a brief and pitiful glance before resuming his work. From the doorway, Linda could make out the chaos within. A bedside lamp lay shattered on the floor, its jagged pieces scattered across the cheap carpet. The bedsheets were missing, yanked clean off the mattress. The nightstand looked as though it had been toppled during a struggle, and dark stains dotted the faded floral wallpaper near the bathroom. But it was the bathroom itself that held her attention. From where she stood, Linda could see a streak of red smeared across the white tiles of the sink. There was a small pool of blood on the bathroom floor, crusted over, but unmistakable. "Oh my God!" Linda whispered, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Tears streamed down her face as she turned to Earl, her voice cracking. "It's his, Earl! It's Carter's! I just know it!" Earl's jaw tightened as he stared into the room, his eyes scanning every detail. His focus landed on the bathroom and the bloody streaks, his fists trembling with barely contained rage. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered through clenched teeth. "Who did this to my boy?" Daniel, standing nearby, spoke carefully. "We think there was some kind of altercation, but there's no clear indication of what led to it, or who else might have been involved. The room was locked from the inside, and there's no sign of Carter or Emily Grayson. Whatever happened here, it didn't end here." Linda shook her head violently, her voice rising in desperation. "So you're telling me they bled my son in this room and then he just disappeared? Where would they take him? Why would she even hurt him?" Rhodes stepped forward, holding a clipboard with preliminary notes. "Mrs. Blake, the blood patterns suggest there wasn't enough loss to indicate, serious harm." He hesitated, glancing nervously at Daniels before continuing. "What it does suggest is that whoever was hurt in that room was still alive when they left it, which means Carter could still be out there." Linda blinked rapidly, grasping onto that sliver of hope. "Still alive? You're sure?" Rhodes hesitated again, but Daniels cut in. "We're not ruling anything out. The evidence here raises more questions than answers. For one, we didn't find any of their personal belongings in the room, no phone, no wallet, nothing to suggest where either of them might have gone after this." "What about the blood?" Earl asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Check the DNA. Prove to me it's not Carter's." "We've already sent samples to the lab," Daniels replied. "It could take up to 24 hours for confirmation. Until then, we're continuing to gather evidence. We're also reviewing additional surveillance footage to see if Carter or Emily was spotted leaving the motel, or if a third party was involved." "A third party?" Linda repeated, shaking her head. "What are you trying to say? That someone else took them?" "It's a possibility," Daniels admitted grimly. "But right now, all we can say for sure is that whoever left this room wanted to cover their tracks." Linda felt the walls closing in on her, the gruesome scene swallowing her whole. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the doorway for support. "I don't care how long it takes," she whispered. "You keep looking. You find my son." Earl, his face a mask of fury, turned back to Daniels. "You better find whoever did this, Sheriff. Because if you don't, I will, and I won't be handing them over to you when I do." Daniels raised a steady hand, nodding solemnly. "We're doing everything in our power, Mr. Blake. Believe me, I want answers just as much as you do." As the Blakes stepped away from the scene, Linda clung to Earl's arm for support, her mind racing with possibilities. Where was Carter now? Was he hurt, scared, or worse? And what role had Emily played in this horrifying mess? The witness testimony. It wasn't until late Tuesday evening that the investigation into Carter Blake's disappearance took an unexpected turn. Sheriff Daniels was sitting at his desk, fields of paperwork piled high around him, when the phone rang sharply, cutting through the oppressive silence of the station. "Sheriff Daniels speaking," he answered briskly, the stress of the past few days weighing heavily in his voice. "Sheriff, this is Deputy Franklin," came the voice on the other end of the line. "I've got someone here at the station you're going to want to talk to. He says he drove a woman matching Emily Grayson's description early Saturday morning, right after Carter went missing." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "A taxi driver?" he asked quickly. "Yes, sir," Franklin replied. "He's rattled, though, keeps saying something about his passenger carrying strange luggage. You want me to hold him here until you can get back?" "Absolutely," Daniel said, standing and grabbing his coat. "I'm on my way. Keep him talking, but don't let him leave." When Daniels arrived at the station 20 minutes later, a wiry man in his mid-30s was sitting in one of the interview rooms, a nervous jitter in his knee as he repeatedly tapped a coffee cup on the metal table. His cab driver's badge was clipped to his shirt pocket, and his name tag identified him as Ryan Kessler. Daniels entered the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. He sat across from Ryan, tossing his hat onto the table. With a calm but authoritative tone, Daniels said, "Mr. Kessler, I'm Sheriff Daniels. I understand you have some information about the woman we're looking for." Ryan nodded hastily, his fingers tapping on the side of the coffee cup. Yeah, I came as soon as I saw her face on the news," he said, his voice pitched with nervous energy. She was the one, the blonde lady. I'm sure of it." Daniels leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened, Mr. Kessler." Ryan took a deep breath, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "It was Saturday morning, really early, like just after 4 a.m. I'd just started my shift. She flagged me down outside that motel on the edge of town, the one they said, the one where you found the blood." Daniels nodded, urging him to continue with a slight motion of his hand. "She was carrying these 2 massive suitcases, big, heavy-looking. She was struggling with them," Ryan said, his eyes darting to the side as if replaying the memory. "She asked me to help load them into the trunk. At first I didn't think anything of it. People travel with a lot of stuff all the time, right?" "But something made you suspicious," Daniels observed, his tone even. "Yeah," Ryan said, scratching the back of his neck. "It was the smell, the damn smell, Sheriff. When I got close to the bags, I could smell it. It was like..." He hesitated, his voice trailing off. "I don't know, like blood or meat, but not fresh, like it had been left out too long." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you ask her about it?" Ryan shook his head quickly, his hands gripping the coffee cup tightly now. "No, I didn't. She was real polite, smiling, cheerful even, said she was catching a last-minute bus and needed a ride to the station. I didn't want to seem rude and I needed the fare, but yeah, man, that smell stuck with me the whole ride." The sheriff gave him a piercing look but remained calm. "Did she say anything else? Anything unusual?" Ryan thought for a moment, frowning. "She kept tapping her phone like she was texting someone, but she never got any calls. And she kept looking out the window like she was checking to see if someone was following us. At the time, I figured maybe she was just nervous about catching her bus. Now, though..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You said she had you take her to the bus station?" Daniels asked. "Yeah, the Greyhound station in the next county over," Ryan confirmed. "When we got there, she made me wait while she ran inside. Came back and handed me a wad of cash, told me to keep the change. I thought that was weird too, it was a lot of change, way more than the ride was worth." Daniels leaned back slightly, absorbing the information. "What happened after that?" Ryan shrugged, his brows furrowed. "She just left. Wheeled those suitcases inside and that was it. I didn't stick around, but the way she was acting, like she was in a hurry, it stuck with me. When I saw her picture on the news tonight, I knew it had to be her." Daniel's expression hardened. "Mr. Kessler, do you think you could identify her suitcases if you saw them again?" Ryan nodded quickly. "Yeah, definitely. They were black with these silver zippers, kind of scuffed up like they'd seen better days." The sheriff scribbled something in his notebook before looking Ryan in the eyes. "You've been very helpful, Mr. Kessler. One last question. Did she say anything about where she was going once she got to the bus station?" Ryan shook his head. "No, but when I was unloading the bags, I saw a bus schedule fall out of her pocket," he said, snapping his fingers as the memory returned. "I glanced at it real quick. One of the times was circled. It looked like she was heading up to St. Louis." Daniels stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the tiled floor. "St. Louis, huh? That's consistent with our intel on her past movements." Ryan's eyes widened slightly. You think she hurt that guy? The doctor, Carter? We're investigating all possibilities, Daniels replied firmly, his words chosen carefully. Thank you for coming forward. You've given us a lead we didn't have before. Leaving the interview room, Daniels found Deputy Rhodes waiting just outside the door. Rhodes's expression mirrored the concern etched into Daniels' face. What do you make of it, Sheriff? Rhodes asked quietly, falling into step beside Daniels as they headed toward his office. Daniels didn't answer immediately, his mind clearly elsewhere. When he finally spoke, his tone was clipped and decisive. If Emily Grayson got on a bus to St. Louis, we need to get ahead of her. Contact the regional bus lines, get the state police involved, and put out an alert for those damn suitcases. If she's carrying what I think she is, we might not have much time. Rhodes swallowed hard. And what about Carter? Daniels stopped in his tracks, his jaw tightening as he turned to look at his deputy. If he's alive, we'll find him. But if those bags are what I think they are, we may already be too late. Emily confesses. It wasn't until late Wednesday night that the breakthrough finally came. After an intense manhunt across state lines, Emily Grayson was apprehended at a dingy motel just outside St. Louis. Exhausted and cornered, she offered no resistance as officers cuffed her and brought her into custody. Her expression was calm, almost vacant, as though the weight of the last few days had finally caught up to her. Sheriff Daniels was the one to break the news to Linda and Earl. Sitting in the dimly lit living room of the Blake household, Linda couldn't stop clutching the edge of her seat as Daniels spoke over the phone. His voice crackled but clear over the static. "We've got her, Mrs. Blake," he said. "Emily Grayson is in custody." Linda squeezed Earl's arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes, but Daniels' tone quickly darkened. "I need you to be prepared. She's agreed to talk, but the details she's given us so far are unsettling. This isn't going to be easy to hear." "What do you mean?" Earl's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge to it as though he were bracing himself for bad news. "We brought her in about an hour ago," Daniels began. "Initially she claimed she knew nothing about Carter's disappearance, said she was just passing through. But when confronted with evidence, the surveillance footage, the cab driver's testimony, her prior record, she finally cracked. She confessed to being involved." Linda's heart stopped for a moment. "Involved?" "In Carter's disappearance," Daniels confirmed grimly. "She implicated herself in what took place at the motel. She says she'll only reveal details face to face, but I'll warn you now, Emily Grayson isn't someone who tells the full truth right away. She's calculating." The next morning, Linda and Earl sat quietly in the observation room at the Riverdale Sheriff's Department, their eyes locked on the interrogation room across the glass. Emily Grayson sat at the steel table, her cuffs loosely secured around her wrists. She looked smaller than they'd imagined, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, her hands folded neatly before her, as if she were just sitting down to a casual chat. When Daniels entered, she flicked her eyes up briefly, offering a faint, detached smile. "Emily," Daniels said as he sat across from her. His tone was steady but firm. "This is your chance to cooperate. You've already admitted to being involved in Carter Blake's disappearance. The sooner you tell us exactly what happened, the better it'll be for you." Emily tilted her head slightly, as though weighing her options, before she let out a small, bitter laugh. "You make it sound like I have so much to lose, Sheriff," she said coolly. "The truth is I already lost the only thing that mattered." Daniels didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Why don't you start at the beginning? Tell me how you met Carter." Emily sighed, flexing her fingers as though the act of talking cost her energy she didn't have. "Carter," she said softly, almost to herself. "He was so kind, so trusting. You see someone like that, and you just... I know they'll help you without asking too many questions." Linda, watching from the observation room, clenched her fists. Emily continued, her voice taking on a wistful tone. "I met him at the grocery store, you know. Funny place, right? I was fumbling through my bag, pretending to look for my wallet. And then there he was, offering to help a poor girl in distress. It was so... easy." She smiled faintly. "Cut the games, Emily," Daniels said sharply, his patience wearing thin. "We know what happened at the motel. What we don't know is why. Why was Carter in that room with you, and what the hell did you do to him?" Emily's smile faltered. She glanced down at her hands, and for a moment, real emotion flickered across her face. Anger, regret, something darker. "He wasn't supposed to get hurt," she muttered. Daniels pressed her. "But he did, didn't he? You drugged him. You lured him into that room. And then what? Things didn't go as planned, did they? Emily's eyes snapped up, her calm demeanor cracking. I didn't plan on hurting him, she snapped. I just wanted him to stay. Long enough for him to understand, to listen. But he kept talking about leaving, about how he couldn't help me. I needed him to stay. Linda gasped audibly in the observation room, tears spilling down her cheeks. Earl reached for her hand but said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. What happened in that room, Emily? Daniels demanded, his voice rising. What did you do? Emily's voice broke as she continued, her words tumbling out in fragments. He got scared, tried to leave, I panicked, I didn't know what to do, I just wanted him to stop, I grabbed the lamp and then… She choked on her words, shaking her head violently. And then what? Daniels leaned closer. I hit him, Emily whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. I didn't mean to, but… There was blood, so much blood, and he wasn't moving. For a long moment the room fell into an oppressive silence. Even Daniels, seasoned as he was, took a measured breath before speaking again. And the suitcases? What did you put in them, Emily? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze shifted, avoiding his eyes as the weight of her actions hung between them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Finally, she whispered, I thought if I hit him, no one would know, no one would ask questions. I didn't want anyone to know how badly I'd messed it all up. Daniel sat back, his expression stoic, though his hands had tightened into fists beneath the table. Emily Grayson, he said carefully, you just confessed to the murder and dismemberment of Carter Blake, and you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for it. Across the glass, Linda collapsed into Earl's arms, her sobs heavy and uncontrollable. Earl held her tightly, his own tears streaming silently down his face. Their worst fears had been confirmed, but in the depths of their grief, a quiet resolve began to take root. Carter Blake's life had ended in violence and betrayal, but they'd make sure his memory was one of compassion, kindness, and love, the very qualities that made him a target for someone like Emily in the first place. The motive and the events. Late Thursday night, as Emily sat in the isolated confines of her cell at the Riverdale Sheriff's Department, details of her motive and the events leading up to Carter Blake's tragic death began to surface during a second round of interrogation. Sheriff Daniels, accompanied by Deputy Rhodes, decided to push Emily further, hoping to glean every last truth about what had driven her to such a horrific act. As Daniels entered the room, Emily perched at the table, her body slouched slightly as though the weight of her guilt was finally settling onto her shoulders. She didn't look up this time but stared blankly at the steel-gray surface of the table. Emily, Daniels began, his voice calm but firm, we need to know the whole story, all of it. You've already admitted what you did in that motel room. Now it's time to tell us why. Emily exhaled a long, shaky breath before looking up at him. Her eyes were hollow, yet there was a flicker of something, anger, maybe bitterness, as she began to speak. You want to know why? She said, her voice thick with unfiltered emotion. Because I wanted him to see me, to really see me, not as some desperate woman who needed his pity, but as someone who mattered, someone worth saving. Daniels remained motionless, watching her. Start at the beginning, he said. Tell me how this started. Why him? What exactly did Carter do that made you target him? Emily leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms as if trying to shield herself from the truth she was about to voice. Her gaze shifted to the corner of the room, far away from Daniels. I met him 3 weeks ago, she began, her voice distant. At a grocery store, like I told you before. I was at a low point. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. My last hustle had gone bad. Someone caught on to one of my credit card scams and I had to run before they nailed me. I was broke and starving and angry at the world. She laughed bitterly before continuing, her tone sharp. And then along comes Carter with his perfect life, his perfect smile, and his perfect concerned gaze. Do you need help? He asked me, like I was some charity project he could fix. I don't know why, but it made me furious. I hated him for that. Daniels frowned, leaning closer. You hated him? Because he was kind to you? Emily's eyes snapped to his, her voice rising. Because people like that don't get it. They look at someone like me and think we're a puzzle to be solved. He thought he could swoop in with his good intentions and make everything better, like I was his responsibility. Do you have any idea how many Carters I've met in my life? People who think they can fix you just long enough to feel good about themselves, then toss you aside when you're too much work? Daniel stared at her, letting her words hang in the air before responding. But Carter wasn't like that, was he? From what we know, he was someone who didn't just help, he cared. Why kill someone who was trying to be your friend? Emily flinched at the word kill, her expression flickering between defiance and regret. You don't understand, she muttered. He wasn't supposed to die. That was never part of the plan." "Then what was the plan?" Daniels pressed. Emily hesitated, chewing her bottom lip as though the admission was physically painful. "He wasn't supposed to leave," she said finally. "I needed him to stay. To keep looking at me like I mattered, to keep talking to me, helping me. I needed someone like him to just make me feel human for a little while longer." Deputy Rhodes, who had been silently taking notes on the other side of the room, cleared his throat, drawing Emily's attention. "You're telling us you killed Carter because you didn't want him to leave?" he asked pointedly. Emily glared at him, her anger flaring again. "I told you, it wasn't like that. He wasn't supposed to die. When he said he had to go, I got scared. I thought if I could just make him stay, he'd realize I wasn't just some lost cause. But he got angry. Said I'd lied to him. He knew something was wrong with me." Daniels leaned in again, his voice gentler now. "What happened, Emily? What changed in that room?" Emily's hands shook as she pressed them flat against the table, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. "He said he was done, that he couldn't help me. He got up to leave, and I panicked. I told him I could change, that I just needed a little more time, but he wouldn't listen. He said I was dangerous. And he was right." She squeezed her eyes shut, as though trying to block out the memory. "I grabbed the lamp to try and stop him. I didn't mean to hit him that hard. But he fell and there was blood. Suddenly he wasn't moving, and I froze. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't call for help. You didn't try to save him," Daniels pointed out, his voice cold. "You packed him into those suitcases. Care to explain that part, Emily?" Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she laughed bitterly through them. "What was I supposed to do, huh? Call 911? Tell them I made a mistake? No one would have believed me. They never do. People like me don't get second chances, so I thought, if I made him disappear, maybe I could move on. Maybe I wouldn't have to feel this way anymore." Rhodes leaned forward, staring at her with disbelief. "Feel what way, Emily? Guilty? Ashamed? Afraid of justice catching up to you?" Emily shook her head, her expression hollow. "Empty," she whispered. "I feel empty. Like there's this void in me that can't be filled, no matter how many people I con or hurt or lie to. Carter was supposed to help fill that void, but instead I just made it bigger." Daniels took a slow breath, his fists clenching under the table as he looked at her. "Emily Grayson," he said firmly, "you didn't just make a mistake. You robbed a family of their son. You took someone who was loved, who made the world a better place, and you silenced him because of your own selfishness. You don't get to sit here and talk about how empty you feel. You don't deserve that luxury." Emily didn't respond, her body slumping into the chair as though she'd deflated entirely. From the observation room, Linda and Earl Blake watched silently through the glass. Linda's tear-streaked face trembled as she turned to Earl, her voice barely above a whisper. "She says she wanted him to stay. That she was lonely. How could anyone destroy someone so good just because they couldn't handle their own pain?" Earl's jaw tightened as he placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but resolute. "Because people like her don't see the good in others, Linda. They see an opportunity. Carter wasn't just good, he was kind, and that's what made her hate him." Lessons from a tragedy. The aftermath of Carter Blake's death left the small town of Riverdale shaken to its core. For Linda and Earl Blake, their loss was more than just personal. It had turned their lives inside out, leaving behind an empty seat at the dinner table, an echoing silence in their home, and a deep scar in their hearts that no time or effort could heal. But amidst the grief came moments of reflection, of searching for the meaning behind the senselessness of it all. On a crisp Friday evening, just a week after Emily Grayson's sentencing, Linda and Earl found themselves sitting on their porch, side by side in quiet contemplation. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Carter's favorite time of day, when the world seemed at peace. "Do you ever wonder," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper, "why Carter had to be the one? Why someone so good, so selfless was taken in such a cruel way?" Earl leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring out at the empty street before them. He let her question hang in the air for a moment before answering. "Every damn day," he muttered. His voice was low and heavy, each word carrying a weight that tugged at his chest. "I've gone over it 1,000 times, Linda. What if he hadn't stopped to help her? What if I'd told him not to go out that night? What if he'd been a little less kind, a little less trusting?" Linda turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But that wasn't who he was, Earl. Carter was kind, and if he hadn't been, he wouldn't have been Carter." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I believe in fate, but maybe Maybe people like Carter were put here to remind us how important it is to care, even when the world doesn't deserve it. Earl straightened up, glancing at her. "And look what that got him," he said bitterly, his jaw tightening. "All that kindness, and he got left in a motel room by some con artist who didn't give a damn about what a good man he was." His voice cracked, and for the first time in days he turned to face her, his eyes burning with frustration. "What's the point of it, Linda? What's the damn point of being good when the world rewards you with nothing but pain?" Linda held his gaze for a moment before she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "Because Carter lived his life with love and purpose, Earl," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "Because he didn't let the ugliness of the world change him, and if we let his death turn us bitter, if we start thinking that kindness doesn't matter anymore, then we've lost him all over again. We can't let her take that from us." Earl looked down at their joined hands, the calluses on his fingers brushing against hers. Tears brimmed in his eyes, but he nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice softening. "We owe it to Carter to keep that part of him alive. But damn, Linda, it's hard. It's so damn hard to find a reason to get out of bed every morning knowing he's gone." Linda's lip quivered, but she pulled herself together, setting her free hand on her husband's shoulder. "We'll find reasons," she whispered. "For Carter, for the people he helped, the lives he touched. His kindness doesn't end with him, Earl. It lives on in us." A few days later, the Blakes found themselves standing in the Riverdale Community Center, surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors who had come together to honor Carter's memory. A photograph of him, bright-eyed and smiling in his scrubs, sat on an easel at the front of the room, surrounded by candles and flowers. Linda stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Earl, who nodded encouragingly from his seat in the front row. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I've thought a lot about what I would say tonight," Linda started, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And to be honest, I wasn't sure if I could find the words to capture who Carter was or what he meant to this town. He wasn't just our son, he was our light." She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd. Carter had a way of making everyone feel like they mattered. Whether it was a patient in the ER, a neighbor needing a helping hand, or someone lost looking for a second chance, Carter gave all of himself without expecting anything in return. That's who he was. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. "And it's so easy, so tempting to let our grief turn to anger, to let this tragedy take away the hope and love that Carter spent his whole life spreading. But I know in my heart that's not what he would want. Carter would want us to keep giving, to keep believing in the good in people, even when it's hard." In the audience, Earl sat silently, his head bowed as tears streamed down his face. The room was thick with emotion, a palpable reminder of the void Carter's absence had left behind. "So, tonight," Linda continued, her voice growing stronger, "I want to challenge all of us to live the way Carter did, to be kind when the world feels cruel, to offer help even when it's inconvenient, to love without limits. That's how we honor him. That's how we make sure his life wasn't in vain." As she stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in quiet applause, a combination of claps, sniffles, and whispered words of agreement. Earl stood to embrace her as she returned to her seat. The weeks that followed were full of slow healing. Linda and Earl, still weighed down by their grief, began volunteering at community events, starting a scholarship in Carter's name for local students pursuing medical careers and organizing town-wide mental health awareness workshops. "Maybe we can't bring him back," Earl said one day as they set up chairs for an event, his voice thoughtful, "but we can keep his legacy alive. We can make sure people remember the kind of man he was, not just in this town but everywhere." Linda nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll help someone else find their path, the way Carter would have."